Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you, other folks, for being here in person today. And we welcome all the people online. It's a much larger audience tuning in by live stream for today's talk by Carolyn Zola, Pepper Pot Stew and Black Female Street Peddlers in Antebellum, Philadelphia. I'm Randy Schwartz with the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. I want to also thank our host for today's program, the Ann Arbor District Library. They provide us this presentation room as well as promotional and technical support so we can share these programs far and wide by live streaming them and by recording and posting them online on the library's YouTube channel. For the new viewers and visitors today, I'd like to briefly introduce you to the Culinary Historians. We're an informal group bringing together all sorts of people interested in the history and culture of food and cooking. The group was founded in 1983, and new members are always welcome. We have well over 150 members currently, about half of them here in Michigan, and the rest are across North America and overseas. We organize monthly talks like this one from September to May, some with in-person speakers and others like this one where the speaker zooms in. We also have twice yearly participatory theme meals for members only, one in the summer and one in late autumn. For example, the meal on July 13th will be on the theme of food from the stands, the stands of Central Asia, those 7 countries from Afghanistan to Uzbekistan. So that'll be fun. If you're not a member of CHAA, we'd love to have you join us. Our membership is only $25 a year for an individual or a couple, and it includes a subscription to our quarterly magazine, Repast. A postal subscription to Repast by itself is only $20 a year, no matter what country you happen to live in. Anyone can write for Repast. Just contact me via the CHAA website, culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org, and we'll talk about it. If you'd like to join our group or just to subscribe to Repast, you can find the info on that website. Click on the membership tab there. You can also follow us on Facebook. Just search for Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor. Or if you're here in person, you can pick up a membership form there at the side table after the Q&A session. By the way, for those watching this live online via YouTube, if you'd like to ask the speaker a question after the talk, you can type it into the chat section and we'll try to convey it to the speaker. After the Q&A today, for those here in person, we'll have some foods inspired by today's talk topic. And we hope you like ginger, because all 3 happen to have ginger in them. A spicy Afro-Caribbean stew of okra and tomato, some gingerbreads sweetened with molasses and sugar, and some ginger beer to wash it all down, non-alcoholic ginger beer. So help yourselves to those snacks after the program. This is our last talk of the school year, so our next talk will be 4 months from now on Sunday, September 28. We've rescheduled Lenny Sorensen's presentation that was canceled by a windstorm last February at her mountain farmstead in Virginia. Dr. Sorensen will speak about Henry Orr, a black caterer in early federal Washington, D.C., on September 28th. And now, finally, I want to introduce today's speaker. We're very pleased to be with Carolyn Zola, a historian of gender, race, and labor. Carolyn was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She earned her bachelor's degree in history at the UC Berkeley, and then last year completed her PhD at Stanford University. Her talk today is an outgrowth of her doctoral dissertation, which was entitled Public Women, Urban Provisioners in 19th Century America. Dr. Zola has received research support from Stanford and from the American Association of University Women, AAUW. In 2023 to 24, she was a long-term dissertation fellow at the Library Company of Philadelphia. That's the famous library founded by Ben Franklin. And then in this school year, she's been a research fellow at that library in its program in early American economy and society. Let's give a warm welcome to Carolyn Zola.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I wish I was there in Ann Arbor with you all so I could enjoy the refreshments after my talk. They sound delicious. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Okay, great. I always check with Zoom. I'm a bit of a Luddite. And thank you all also for being here on this beautiful Sunday. It's a glorious day here in Philadelphia where I am, so I can imagine it's equally lovely around the country as spring finds its full form. And so I appreciate everyone being indoors and on a screen or in the room to be here for the talk today. Right. When Rebecca Tillman's husband died in the 1840s, she sold pepper pot stew in order to support herself and her 3 young children. Turning to food selling in the face of poverty and personal tragedy was a common survival strategy for women, Black and white both, during the first decades of this country's history. But one detail sets Tillman apart. Her husband had not been a laborer, a mariner, or a hod carrier, one of the typical forms of employment found by most poor Black men during this time. Rather, he was the first Black lay pastor of the African Zohar Church, an important religious institution in the 19th century and up until this day in Philadelphia. Pepper pot stew and the women who sold it allow us to see more clearly the contours of Black women's lives and labors during this period. Today, I'll mostly focus on early 19th century Philadelphia and the countless Black women who hawked this stew on the streets. Occasionally, I'll include a little discussion of women who sold other kinds of goods, and we're going to make a brief foray little ways north into New York City. As many who are part of this Zoom and in the actual room itself know and have indeed written about, a version of pepper pot stew originated in the Caribbean, and it arrived in Philadelphia in the colonial period. I found evidence of the dish being sold on the streets in the 1760s, but it seems to have become most prominent beginning in the 1780s and 90s. Philadelphia pepper pot is typically made with tripe and other cheap cuts of meat, as well as vegetables and lots of spices. Some recipes include dumplings, but many do not. Over the course of the 19th century, it became a popular street food, familiar to people far from Philadelphia. Campbell's Soup Company sold a canned version into the 1980s. And in the 1960s, Andy Warhol included a can of pepper pot in one of his famous screen prints. So while it's still very popular across the Caribbean, it is less well known in the United States today, despite this prominence it once had. Even less well known are the numerous women who supported themselves during the 19th century selling the stew, often for just a few cents a bowl. But to their contemporaries, they were central parts of the fabrics of urban worlds. The seemingly simple act of making and selling pepper pot stew required a whole host of skills. Knowing where and when to obtain the bounty of rural spaces took knowledge and social connections. Turning the cheapest cuts of meat, typically tripe, like I said, into a savory feast required the knowledge of finding sellers of meat and preparation techniques to clean and then transform tough flesh into an appealing dish. And understanding how to work with peppers, whose capsicum could burn the hands or eyes, also took skill. Determining when and where to sell their goods depended on geographical deftness. Some sellers staked out corners to call their wares, filling the air with their characteristic cries. Others circulated throughout city spaces, presumably to better their odds of finding hungry customers. Some found spots outside of theaters or other traditionally masculine social spaces. While ubiquitous in their own time, studying Black sellers of pepper pot stew, as well as other goods like hot corn, baked pears, and roots and herbs, presents many challenges. They come into view only briefly when white observers waxed poetic about their melodious cries, critics brooded about their provisions, or the law became entangled with their lives. Even these extant sources present difficulties. Newspaper accounts that reported on the activities of these women, for instance, often expressed deeply racist views that say far more about the white authors than about these sellers' lives. Overly romantic reminiscences about the cries of Black women peddlers similarly offer a distorted view of these women, often reflecting more about the nostalgia of white men than the lived experiences of Black women. Frequently, these sellers warranted a mention in a newspaper only when they were the victims or, far less frequently, the perpetrators of violence. Each clue feels slippery, suspect, and insubstantial. Yet their lives warrant scholarly attention for several reasons. Typically given only a cursory mention in most historical research, these peddlers were fixtures on the streets and in the markets of northern cities during the 19th century. And here you have one of the most famous markets of the day, Philadelphia's High Street Market. I've never been able to identify any pepper pot peddlers in this image, but I'm sure they're there, or they would have been there. These women's largely invisible struggles against the hierarchies of race and gender need to be examined more fully to understand the mechanisms of power that operated. Two sets of census records help bring their lives into focus, and I'd recommend these for anyone interested in Antebellum, Black Philadelphia. They're just incredible, rich details. There are two censuses taken in one in the 1830s and one in the 1840s by Quakers trying to combat the escalating anti-Black violence that was building in Philadelphia, or in Pennsylvania more generally. The records reflect both white sympathies for Black Americans, which was fairly rare in this period, as well as some class and race prejudices. These census records provide useful details, but they themselves are rather incomplete and present some mysteries. So, for instance, in the 1838 census, only one woman is identified as a pepper pot seller, but in the 1847 census, something like 5 or 6 are. And I know just from other sources that far more than 5 or 6 women during this period were selling this stew. So they give some insights, but also I think can be, have to be interpreted carefully. Despite these shortcomings, the censuses still offer unusually rich information about Black female food sellers. Layered together with print and visual culture, these ubiquitous but elusive sellers come into view. While it's impossible to ascertain the numbers of peddlers in northern cities during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, their presence in public space provoked considerable commentary. Some visual culture from the early 19th century recognized and affirmed the dignity of the work performed by 19th century street peddlers. John Lewis Crimmel's 1811 painting Pepper Pot, a scene in the Philadelphia market, features a slender Black woman. The peddler sits at the center of the image, her gleaming pot of stew beside her, surrounded by white customers of various social classes and ages. Visually, she commands the viewer's attention. She wears no shoes or head covering, marking her as poor and perhaps young. The promiscuous group of white men, women, and children represent some of the Philadelphians who would have visited that city's famed market. The various characters in the scene react differently to the spicy soup. A shabby older white woman seems to enjoy her meal as she absent-mindedly eats. Another woman, perhaps a mother, tries to feed a reluctant-looking child. Two elite white women pause to consider a purchase, perhaps slightly scandalized by the scene before them. And an older man, dressed in what looks to be a Revolutionary War uniform, now ragged and worn, wearily eats his soup. A strapping laborer, I think Crimmel was still figuring out scale in this work. He really looms over the image. But he nonetheless seems to be ordering a bowl, finding the only sustenance he can afford. Similarly, The Cries of Philadelphia, a well-known children's book from the period, also features a pepper pot seller in a place of prominence. This peddler appears to be a full-figured, middle-aged Black woman wearing a bonnet. Although her limbs and torso blend into the image, her tub of stew stands out. In the foreground, an elegantly dressed Black couple wait for their food, while in the background, a Black laborer and a white customer linger. The text and image evoke a sense of social harmony and even the regularity with which such gatherings occurred, stressing that the picture offered a good view of the group that often assemble around the tub. Other print culture during this time found much to mock in such racially diverse settings, but this image contains no racial mockery or ethnic hatred. Instead, the reader is assured that the woman sells her stew very cheap so that a hungry man may get a hearty meal for a few cents. Besides simply recognizing the dignified labor performed by street peddlers, the two images of pepper pot settlers emphasize the affective labor such peddlers performed by depicting groups of people gathered around the women in harmonious social relationships. While some information about pepper pot peddlers can be gleaned from visual culture, learning about the actual women who did this work during the first decades after the revolution is difficult. A few clues offer intriguing hints. In 1785 or 1786, a woman known only as Dinah fled her enslaver, James Anderson. It is not known how she slipped away from his home in Chester County, Pennsylvania, but having freed herself physically, if not legally, she made her way to Philadelphia. Whether she had friends or family in the city is unclear, but we do know how she sustained herself during that time. Rather than tucking herself into domestic service, laundry, or other more discreet forms of labor available to Black women, she sold pepper pot stew in the market, hiding in plain sight from her enslaver and any of his associates who might have wanted to collect the $4 reward he offered. For over a year, Dinah passed for a free woman and was seen numerous times in the market. Tax records and Pennsylvania's Registry of Enslaved People offer some clues about Dinah's life during the years before she escaped Anderson in Chester County. She does not appear on his records in 1779 or for the years previous to that, in fact. Enslaved people were listed on tax assessments during this period, but she does appear in the 1780 slave registry. It is possible that Anderson did not purchase her until 1780, but this seems likely given that this was the year that Pennsylvania enacted gradual emancipation. A more likely answer is that he hired Dinah out during the late 1770s and so did not have to pay taxes for her labor that year. This theory also helps make sense of Dinah's decision to flee and her ability to support herself after her escape. If she'd been hired out to nearby Philadelphia in the years before she fled, she might have been able to make her escape and situate herself in that bustling city, knowing that she could survive with her culinary skills. Dinah might have become familiar with pepper pot if she had visited Philadelphia with Anderson or been hired out in that city. She might have learned to make the dish from other Black women in or near Anderson's home, or she might have developed these specific culinary skills while living in the Caribbean, where a version of the stew originated. Wherever Dinah learned to make pepper pot, her skills allowed her to sustain herself against tremendous odds. I've looked at the vagrancy dockets from the 1790s in Philadelphia, and there are many, many examples of escaped enslaved people being apprehended and returned, against their will. And so the fact that she was able to evade detection for at least a year and a half is quite remarkable and very, very lucky. What might Dinah have encountered upon arriving in Philadelphia? Knowing with any certainty is impossible, but any number of features of late 18th century urban life could have shaped her experiences. Philadelphia was relatively small during this period, a walking city, but during this time, it was also incredibly dense, very compact, with a population of nearly 30,000 people. So Francois Furstenberg, a historian of this period, has compared Philadelphia in the decades after the revolution to Mumbai, not in terms of geographic scale or footprint, but in terms of density of people in a particular space. During the 19th century, Philadelphia would become sharply stratified along racial, ethnic, and class lines. But in this earlier period, rich and poor, black and white, all lived in close proximity to one another. Beginning in the 17th century, Philadelphia represented a key node in the network of Atlantic trade that came to prominence during the colonial and 17th and 18th centuries. But even after independence from Britain, it maintained its status as a vital port. This bustling, globally connected city would have provided Dinah the opportunity to blend in, support herself, and evade recapture. Almost certainly, upon her arrival in the city, she would have depended upon the support of Black residents, but detecting these connections is impossible. Indeed, women like Dinah would have taken care to keep such relationships hidden, both for her safety and for the safety of her friends. As she settled into this diverse commercial hub, Dinah might have pursued several different avenues. If she were lucky or savvy, she might have made connections with some of the established pepper pot sellers who hawk stew in that city, whether in permanent operations on the streets or in market stalls. The sale of dressed victuals, including pepper pot stew, boiled Indian corn, and pickled oysters, was widespread enough that municipal authorities enacted ordinances in an attempt to limit this activity. The sale of pepper pot in or near the high street market would only be permitted on Wednesdays and Saturdays, official market days, and only during market hours. Such ordinances did not seem to have stopped the sale of the popular stew, however. More importantly, the Common Council's attempts to curtail the pepper pot trade likely reflects its ubiquity and popularity. Seemingly undisturbed by such ordinances, pepper pot stew hawkers Polly Hain, Flora Calville, Rose Pierce, and Hester Hill listed their businesses in local directories and surely would have been familiar sights on streets or in the markets. Little is known about these women, but evidence suggests that Calville might have been part of the diaspora from Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, that flooded Philadelphia amidst the upheaval of the world's first successful anti-slavery revolution. And I want to just briefly thank Dr. William Moyes Weaver for helping me with Flora Calville and a pepper pot peppermint mystery I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if folks are interested. I very much appreciate his expertise and scholarly generosity. A few other details about Dinah can be teased out, but they're difficult to confirm. According to Anderson, Dinah spoke broken English, suggesting she was born outside of the Anglophone world, but determining precisely where is impossible. The name Dinah comes from the Old Testament, but offers no geographic clues. Anderson described Dinah as, quote, fat and lusty, which at first I assumed reflected insidious ideas about Black women and sexuality that circulated across the British Atlantic world. But the word lusty also connoted ideas of health and vigor during this time. The phrase might have been intended as a visual description, that of a stout, robust woman. Earlier in the 18th century, lusty suggested arrogance or insolence, although it is not clear if that meaning was in use in the late 18th century. If that meaning persisted in Dinah's time, it might have reflected Anderson's frustrations with her refusal to accept his authority. Dinah's decision to sell food in the market gestures to the multiple meanings of commercial exchange during gradual emancipation in Pennsylvania. For a hungry customer without much money, a few cents could procure a warm bowl of comforting stew. For Dinah, those few cents enabled her to support herself in an economic system that subordinated her based on her legal status, race, and gender. That is not to say that commercial enterprises carried out by market sellers like Dinah were liberatory. Rather, confronting sharply constrained occupational possibilities, it seems that Dinah chose the best option she could. Philadelphians could enjoy pepper pot in a broad range of establishments. One renowned pepper pot establishment was run by a black man named John Coates on Margaretta Street. Coates was an active participant in the Black community. He was, for instance, an early member of the Black Freemason Lodge in that city. He was prominent enough to be mocked in a series of satirical articles published in a local paper, The Tickler, along with other prominent Black men like Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. And again, if anyone's interested, I can go into more detail about finding John Coates in the Tickler. It came as a bit of a surprise to me. I'm so happy to go into more detail about that in the Q&A. It is unclear if Coates's wife and daughter worked in his establishment, but this seems likely given the logic of the family economy that governed during this time. Even as Coates ran this popular establishment, which featured well-scoured tables, white sanded floors, and white napkins, at least one Black woman hawked her own pepper pot stew from the pavements of Christchurch nearby. Located on 2nd Street near Market, the woman would have been well situated near the bustling commercial corridor anchored by Philadelphia's main market, that market I showed you at the very beginning, High Street Market. Even at night, she was in a good spot to attract passers-by. The spicy stew held strong appeal for Philadelphians, whether they enjoyed the dish seated in comfort or standing on the street. Coates and his family found a degree of economic security by making and selling pepper pot, while the unnamed woman depended on her own small, informal, and itinerant business in order to support herself. Pepper pot stew was but one of a range of foodstuffs Black women sold, sometimes in partnership with a husband. In decades later, in the 1840s, Joseph Henry and his wife seemed to create a kind of family economy themselves, keeping an eating stand in the market. They fared somewhat better than many of their fellow Black Philadelphians. The Henrys possessed $300 in personal property, which did not make them wealthy, but represented a substantial financial cushion. A mixture of food-related labor supported the household of Southern Fortin as well. And as a side note, I've tried to connect Southern Fortin to the prominent James Fortin, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, in that family, but I've not been able to establish a connection. I think the name must be a coincidence. Southern Fortin worked as a waiter, earning $12 a month. His wife worked as a huckster and washed laundry. They appear to have had a young child and were involved in their local religious community. Similarly, Samuel Johnson kept an oyster stand, assisted by his son and his wife, who dealt in vegetables. None of these families were wealthy or even middle class, but they found a stable livelihood through various forms of provisioning. While pepper pot peddlers did not become wealthy, compared to many marginal urban dwellers, they earned comparatively decent incomes. Elizabeth Perry and Elizabeth Green, two women who sold pepper pot stew, each earned $5 a week in the 1840s. Elizabeth Perry sent her children to school, something that was out of reach for the poorest Americans during this time. Elizabeth Green's teenage children worked instead of going to school, perhaps after completing some education. Her living circumstances appear to have been very dreary, however. Like so many poor folks living in Philadelphia during this time, Green paid far more for her dismal accommodations than they were worth. The census taker noted that her house and the two beside it were very poor tenements, not worth half the money paid. Mary Thomas, whose household included two orphans as well as two other children, commanded an extraordinary $10 a week for her stew. Two of the boys who lived with her worked in a brickyard, further contributing to the household income, and one child attended school. In addition to being able to send one of her children to school, Thomas owned real estate valued at $900. While not representative, her pepper pot enterprise reveals that in some cases, this dangerous, arduous work could provide some benefits for the next generation. In one case, a Black provisioner was connected to a very prominent Philadelphia family. Elizabeth Boustille, and I always heard it pronounced Boustille, but I've recently heard people descended from the family refer to it as the name is Bustle. So I'm going to go with Bustle, but I'm still trying to sort out what the accepted pronunciation is. So my apologies for confusion. Elizabeth Bustle was married to David Bustle, who was the son of a very famous Black Quaker activist named Cyrus Bustle, who himself had been trained as a biscuit maker and a bread maker. Elizabeth kept a stand in the market, probably Callow Hill Market in Philadelphia's Northern Liberties District. The Bustle family was active in anti-slavery activism and in the fight for Black rights. Elizabeth's involvement in the struggle is difficult to ascertain, but it is very likely she was also committed to the cause, as were so many Black women during this period. David's activities, her husband's activities, were clear. There's an account of him defending somebody accused of being an escaped enslaved person in court, and that person being let free. Their son, Joseph, was an active conductor on the Underground Railroad. It's not clear, but one could imagine that Elizabeth's stand in the market, where so many people would have circulated, um, operated as a key node through which information flowed, helping bring people out of bondage. The bustles were exceptional, but they were also part of an important pattern. Whether selling pepper pot stew or running an eating stand, this kind of work, prominent, public, and with an ambiguous relationship to white authority, provoked scorn from some 19th century whites. Even though food selling meant fairly modest earnings, it drew racist attacks. Such work could be better compensated than many occupations open to Black Philadelphians, and it also, as I said, set them outside of formal employment relationships with middle class or elite whites. This tenuous form of independence through provisioning work was ridiculed in print culture. A poem from the 1820s that later became a minstrel song called Ching-a-ring Cha encapsulated a very specific, gendered, racist line of attack. The song featured a Black man trying to convince a group of enslaved men to leave Buckra land for Haiti. Once in Haiti, a free Black republic, the singer promises that they will leave behind the arduous labor and find pleasure, smoking fine cigars, enjoying wine, and bedecking their wives in diamonds. In this life of leisure, their daughters will learn to play the piano instead of calling hot corn and pepper pot all hot. Rather than being forced into the streets to transact business, these young Black girls and women will enjoy the protection and sanctity of domestic space, imagined to be the domain of white women alone. Instead of laboring, they will have free time to walk the lovely lawn or rest in shady grove. The imagined humor of this song was based in the notion of Black male independence and their claims to middle class status and white privileges and pleasures, as so much minstrelsy did. Pepper pot and hot corn selling were often linked, as in the song, both in economic terms and in the white imagination. When Black girls and women sold these goods, it was often seen as ordinary or a cause for mockery. But with white girls, hot corn selling provoked a very different reaction. In contrast to the racist ridicule in some cultural representations of food selling by Black girls, depictions of food selling by white girls generated alarm among antebellum observers. The apotheosis of white girls white girls food selling generated sorry, getting tripped up on my tongue here. The apotheosis of reformers' panic can be found in Solon Robinson's famous series of sketches, Hot Corn, Life Scenes in New York Illustrated. In these stories, Robinson detailed the wretched existence of New York's infamous Five Points neighborhood. In a particularly emotionally moving tale, The Story of Little Katie, he describes encountering a young white waif, plaintively crying hot corn on the street. The moral heart of the story revolves around the evils of drink and the white family in disarray. The Story of Little Katie was such a sensation that it became the basis for stage plays, sheet music, like you see here, and minstrel shows. While Ching-a-ring Cha rooted its racial mockery in the very notion of Black middle-class families and the ability of daughters to remove themselves from paid work of selling on the street, Little Katie's pathos hinged on an inverted message. Tragedy, not humor, resulted. In addition to minstrel songs and racial mockery that targeted Black families, accounts of criminal or deceptive behavior among Black women food sellers circulated in the press during the first decades of the 19th century. One newspaper account brooded about the supposed poisoning of a Philadelphian by two pepper pot peddlers who hawked their wares door to door. Another account amusedly reported on a brawl between Black peddlers of the stew and white huckster women in Philadelphia. Another newspaper article suggested that food scraps from Philadelphia's tables appeared in the pots of pepper pot sellers. In contrast to early 19th century children's books that celebrated the work performed by pepper pot vendors, a children's book from the 1840s warned that young readers must not try the dish, stating that a single spoonful will excoriate the mouth and throat, and connecting pepper pot to a love of drink. While the white press leveled a variety of accusations of disorder at Black food peddlers, these women were far more frequently the victims of urban chaos, not its agents. Women hawking food on the street, especially since they sold at night and often to male customers who were very likely part of an emerging masculine urban subculture that in part was defined by alcohol and a kind of rowdy behavior. Um, and again, I want to just thank Dr. William Moyes Weaver for helping me make that connection a little more strongly. But vendors who were selling to these men understood the risks inherent in operating their picayune trade on the streets, interacting carefully with these customers. 19th century cities were often violent places, and the dynamics appearing in surviving newspaper accounts suggest that Black peddlers understood how fraught this terrain could be. In 1839, a man named John Biddy took to quarreling over the proper amount of change owed him, eventually getting arrested for his belligerence. In 1836, a young man was charged with rude and disorderly conduct toward a Black woman selling hot corn on a Philadelphia street corner. When a customer tried to evade payment for the pepper pot he had consumed, a vendor issued a gentle reminder. The man struck a violent blow, prostrating her on the pavement. Similarly, in 1865, a James Donovan purchased some pepper pot stew from a respectable old lady. He accused her of not giving him the proper change for his 10-cent bowl, so she gave him the additional money he erroneously demanded. Unmollified, he threw a lot of filth into her kettle, which ruined the soup and destroyed her ability to sell for the rest of the night or perhaps longer. These peddlers, caught in dynamics with unreasonable, violent white male customers, tried to diffuse the situations, but they suffered at the hands of those who felt they had the right to lash out violently. The simple unpredictability of the streets meant that peddlers had to vigilantly monitor their surroundings. Charles Jones, a quote, vagabond youngster, attacked a seller known as the Pepper Pot Lady. When he demanded stew from her, she refused, explaining that she needed to sell it to support her children. Acting strangely, he crawled along like a dog before striking her in the face. The pepper pot seller tried logic, moral and maternal appeals, and firm refusal, all in the hopes of making her case to Jones. Her attempts proved unsuccessful, and she suffered a violent attack. Even a youngster could pose a threat to street sellers. Some visual culture from this period captures the ways in which peddlers had to be on their guard. Nicolino Collio's The Hot Corn Seller, as you see here, features a young Black woman who sits alone, perched on a curb. She looks wary. Her lips are slightly parted, as if she might have just finished singing her wares, as did so many street sellers. The hot corn seller looks as if she has learned by harsh experience to be vigilant. Such savvy would have been a vital skill for Black peddlers working alone in urban spaces or at night. While many sellers worked alone, there is also evidence of the communal bonds formed by Black provisioners. In addition to selling prepared foods like hot corn and pepper pot, or keeping an eating stand, free and enslaved Black Northerners earned money by gathering and selling herbs like calamus or pokeweed, according to the observations of New York butcher Thomas DeVoe. Such foraging would have represented a deeply local knowledge of the spaces they inhabited. Almost certainly, this type of selling would have been performed along with other work dictated by enslavers or pieced together with other kinds of informal labor. While only traces of these foraging provisioners can be found, they formed a social world supported by their work in or around urban markets. As late as the 1850s, DeVoe talked with an old woman near Catherine Market, one of these enslaved Long Islanders. Many Black New Yorkers had, for the last 50 years, visited this market on Sunday mornings. Speaking with the peddler, whose roots and herbs she had displayed for sale on a cellar door, He asked about the formerly enslaved people who still came to the market. The woman replied that only a few still attended and that the rest were all dead. DeVoe, rarely attuned to the emotional lives of others, reported that the last 5 words came forth with a good deal of feeling. Pausing briefly, the woman began to name those lost friends and acquaintances who had died, disappeared, and gone away, she did not know where. Although this once vibrant world had dissolved for decades, enslaved Black New Yorkers may have found pleasure, companionship, and compensation away from the households of their enslavers through their commercial activities. The discourse concerning Black food sellers transformed dramatically over the course of the 19th century. During the early Republic, some cultural production praised Black women's industrious labor and ability to create harmonious, if temporary, social hubs. Antebellum observers obsessed over the perceived disorder posed by these same provisioners or used the tropes of minstrelsy to undermine their legitimacy. In the aftermath of the Civil War and the formal end of slavery, whites grew increasingly preoccupied with Black women's labor. In this fraught context, the pepper pot woman became an instantly recognizable, if briefly lived, figure, a kind of female stereotype akin to but sharply distinct from more well-known figures like Mammy. In the white imagination, the pepper pot woman, like Mammy, directed her energies into the care of whites. Instead of being embedded in domestic space and familial bonds, though, the pepper pot woman engaged in explicitly commercial yet nurturing relationships situated in public space. The pepper pot woman became so widely known and so instantly recognizable that by the late 19th century, white women dressed up as these sellers in a kind of little studied informal minstrelsy. In an 1871 skating competition in San Francisco, contestants wore the costume of pepper pot vendors to represent the capital old aunties. The characterization of pepper pot peddlers amidst a collection of racist stereotypes suggests that to late 19th century whites, the seller of a Philadelphia street food was familiar enough to receive praise in a costume event even all the way across the country in San Francisco. 2 decades later, a gala for the Young Men's Hebrew Association in Philadelphia featured numerous costumed guests, including a cat demon, a pepper pot vendor, a snake charmer, and a fortune teller. While Black women turned to pepper pot peddling across the 19th century as a means of survival, the image of the pepper pot woman became a trope that communicated particular ideas about Black women and labor. At first glance, the pepper pot woman seems to be derived from stereotypes of Black women, like I said, like Mammy, but significant differences define the depictions of pepper pot peddlers in the white imagination. Rather than representing Black women's care of white families, and especially white children, in domestic space, discourse on pepper pot sellers embedded them in relationships of care that were both public and commercial in nature. For instance, an article in Harper's Weekly from 1876 called Philadelphia Street Characters, an image of which you see here, depicted various kinds of peddlers, including a buxom maternal Black woman selling her stew, smiling warmly as a wild-eyed white boy consumes the spicy stew. According to the article, the pepper pot woman was sure to draw a crowd of hungry customers eager for a good breakfast, echoing earlier positive ideas about Black women pepper pot sellers' ability to act as social anchors. The idea that Black pepper pot sellers' energies should be directed towards whites finds its fullest expression in an 1882 story of love and loss, suffused with lost cause nostalgia. Just pure lost cause narratives here. In the tale, a formerly enslaved woman named Julia Gibson, who had learned to make pepper pot stew on a plantation in Alabama, made her way to Philadelphia during the Civil War. Separated from the man who enslaved her and his daughter, Alice, who Julia had nursed and cared for as her own, she set up a business selling pepper pot stew in the winter and hot corn in the summer. One cold night, she encountered the girl half-starved on the street. During their reunion, Julia learns that her former enslaver is sick and dying. Julia and Alice rush to him, where Julia cares for him and brings him to a doctor. Though the ruptures of war had dispersed them, Julia's commercial activities, public orientation, and care of whites reunited them, saving these former enslavers from starvation and death. The story reconceived the nurturing of whites, imagined as flowing naturally from the figure of Mammy into the public commercial care performed by the figure of the pepper pot woman. And again, the particulars around pepper pot are specific to this story, but the imagined affective bonds between enslavers and the formerly enslaved are right out of the Lost Cause playbook. Another aspect of the mothering labors these sellers performed, according to this discourse, involved guiding whites towards proper behavior. In contrast to an antebellum incident in which a noted prankster tricked an elderly pepper pot seller into spilling hot soup over herself and evaded punishment, the new genre of anecdotes featured older Black women who gently corrected men's rascally behavior. A handful of similar stories involved rowdy firemen and pepper pot vendors. Firemen were connected to that masculine subculture I talked about just a little while ago. They're kind of important figures in it. A group of Philadelphia firemen would regularly buy pepper pot from a venerable old auntie. From time to time, an associate outside would raise a false cry of fire, and the vendor would be left without being paid. Eventually, the seller puts a stop to the practice by establishing this rule: pay your money down, boys, in case of fire. With humor, she corrects their youthful misbehavior and leads them towards appropriate modes of manhood. Her nudge was also bound up with ideas of commercial exchange because it ensured that she got paid. While she warmly corrected the firemen's pranks, in reality, white men could abuse these peddlers, often with impunity. When famed pepper pot seller Charlotte Harris died in 1922, she had been selling pepper pot stew from her wagon for over 45 years. She had become a beloved Philadelphia figure, known to many for her delectable soup. Her work, unlike many other peddlers, had allowed her to buy several properties, a remarkable achievement for a Black woman in Jim Crow America. Her obituary emphasized how her customers would mourn her, but made no mention of children, husband, family, or friends who would grieve her loss. As with much popular culture around the pepper pot woman, her economic and affective labor were oriented to her white customers. But surely Harris was deeply anchored in a world beyond what we can see. How she learned to make the dish is not known, but it seems likely that she might have learned it from other people in her community growing up. She would have been 25 when she began hawking the stew, perhaps struggling to raise children, care for older relatives, and keep a household together, the kinds of burdens that fall most heavily on the shoulders of women. She might have sold the stew, even as she performed other kinds of waged labor. Precarious employment, so ubiquitous in our own time, has a long history, and for centuries this country's poor performed multiple kinds of paid work, along with the unremunerated labor of keeping oneself and one's family fed, clothed, and housed. Harris might have been part of one of the many different churches, social organizations, or beneficial societies that grew up in Philadelphia across the 19th and 20th centuries. For white observers, these ubiquitous peddlers provisioning labor provoked ire, mockery, or concern. But for the women themselves, this work represented a form of survival and even success in the face of white animosity. Thank you.
Hold on a second. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Should I stop sharing screen so my large face can be beamed into the room?
We do have a question from our watchers on YouTube. So if those of you in the room don't mind, I'm going to start us off with that, and then we can transition into questions within here. But someone was wondering if you would please share the William Wise Weaver story.
Yes. Well, so this gets a little bit into the weeds of archival research. So William Wise Weaver and a number of other historians put together a marvelous exhibit called The Larder Invaded in the 1980s on Philadelphia food culture. There are printed books on this that came out of the exhibit that I recommend anyone interested search out. They're wonderful. And when I was at the Library Company of Philadelphia last year, I was able to look through the research materials that had been sort of the basis of this project. And through those and others of his work and their work, I learned of a woman named Flora Calville who sold pepper pot. And so I, diligently looked through a number of online directories. They had cited one that she had been listed in, and I kept looking through, on the years before and after to see how much I could sort of situate her in time. Directories during this period are wonderful sources of information, but they're very inconsistent. So people appear and disappear a little idiosyncratically. And so I saw the entry that they mentioned in a directory. I looked for the next year, and it says, and so the original entry is Flora Calville, pepper pot maker, Tammany Court or Tammany Street. The next year I look and there's Flora Calvin, peppermint maker, Tammany Street. And so I thought, wait, is she a peppermint maker? Is she Flora Calvin? Is she Flora Calvin? Like I felt like the earth falling away beneath my feet. And so I thought, oh my goodness, so I emailed Dr. William Moyes-Weaver and with my panicked query, and he very kindly kind of talked me through the research and assured me that she was a pepper pot seller, and shared his own knowledge to help me solve what was becoming a spiraling mystery in my own mind.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions in the room that would like to be asked? I do also have another one from YouTube, but let's.
Thank you. I was wondering if you had a sense or could give us a sense of the relative numbers of enslaved versus free African Americans in Philadelphia in the first few decades of the 1800s. I know that I've read about many slave plantations where the enslaved people were allowed on Sunday, for example, a day off to tend their own gardens or even sell foods from it at a local market. And I'm wondering, did you run across that phenomenon in Philadelphia, that enslaved people were perhaps pepper pot sellers?
That's a great question. And yes, you're right. In places like Charleston, Barbados, in the Caribbean, these sort of slave societies, or a version of slave societies, Black enslaved sellers were very, very prominent and really important figures in market commerce. There's a terrific article called Market Marinage by a historian named Shauna Sweeney that goes into detail about the dynamics of escape and it's sort of temporary escape that enslaved people could sort of take advantage of in those kinds of places. In Philadelphia, the demographics, from what I can tell, don't allow that kind of a sort of temporary escape, temporary marinage. There are significant numbers and they're prominent, but they're not the majority in the same way. So I don't know if that fully answers the question. I guess to sort of put it a different way, there are opportunities, but they are, I think, far fewer in large part because of the dynamic, the demographics. Oh, sorry. And I have one more, one more bit to maybe add to that. Not in Philadelphia, but in New York, I have evidence of a woman who was in the first years of the 19th century. So I think the article I have is, or the evidence from around 1811 or so, a woman named Margaret who was held by an enslaver in Brooklyn. And she, I think her days off, could sell on the streets hot corn in the summer and baked pears in the winter. And so that's, an example of a much smaller tendril of this larger ecosystem that is really, really much more commonplace in the low country and in the Caribbean.
I do have two questions from our YouTube audience. The first is, do you know how the peddlers got the peppers for their pots? Were they fresh, dried, or powdered?
This is a great question. So the honest answer, and I will be honest with you, honest with you all, I don't know. I initially assumed that the peppers they got were from the Caribbean. I thought they were from other parts of the world. But as I was preparing for this talk, I saw Randy was kind enough to share a little bits of information about some attendees, and I saw a book on chilies that I am excited to read that suggests that there were chilies being grown in Maryland, and so that doesn't get to the sort of the dried, the fresh, or the powdered piece of it, but it is making me think about geographic routes a little more differently than I had been. But that's a great question. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Another question that came through was, pepper pot stew is to this day a popular staple in parts of Nigeria. Is this a separate culinary pathway from the Caribbean origins of the Philly stew, or is the Caribbean stew at its origin Nigerian?
I think, and I will, there are experts in African, diasporic foodways. So I'll defer to the expertise in the Zoom room. But my sense is, and from the reading I've done, that it is heavily influenced by West African food, and then it sort of meets Amerindian foodways in the Caribbean and develops into something specific there, comes to Philadelphia and becomes yet something else in Philadelphia, but that they're all sort of connected to each other through these foodways.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yep, hold on.
You mentioned a number of other foods that were sold besides the pepper pot stew, and I'm wondering, did you run across any others that were sort of meals in a single dish, as opposed to just individual things like corn, oysters, and so forth?
That's also a really good question. I think, at least where I'm looking, and I think this is a sort of a mid-Atlantic story, and I think would be different if you looked in, say, New Orleans, or again in Charleston. There might be different iterations on sort of the one bowl meal or the one stop meal. The other references I've seen are to, nuts, cakes, things that are more like a street snack, maybe not a full meal. And it really occurred to me that, that bowl of stew for a few pennies, I think in the 1820s, the article about I briefly talked about the two women who are accused of selling pepper pot stew door to door and poisoning one of their customers. I think that the woman had bought 3 cents worth of stew, but just thinking about the sort of economics of like just a few cents and a really like nutrient dense food has got me thinking in some interesting new ways about customers and how important this was for customers as a sustenance if they themselves were also poor.
I also have another YouTube-based question here. As a Black and woman-owned business, I still face some of the discriminations or sabotage you spoke of. How was this combated back then?
So this is hard to say in the records, because, as I said in the beginning, the archive is so incomplete and sort of filtered through white writers, lawmakers, commentators. It is very, very difficult to see those kinds of strategies. What I've seen and what I think is hinted at in the sources, without overreading them, are sort of Black women's communal or sort of solidarity with each other and with their communities. So I didn't have time in the talk to share this anecdote, but there were many accounts of, as I shared, Black women being attacked or, harassed by white customers. And I only found one instance of a woman fighting back. And so a customer attacked this woman, and she, I think she hit him back, and she went and she got her friends. And actually, there's a riot came out of it, like a pretty violent episode. A few people died. a number of people are arrested. So this is probably not a useful strategy for our own times, but I think that the sort of connecting with other people, and I suspect that, again, hidden in the archive, something that's hard to see is that women, if they're out on the corners, or on the markets around the or sort of scattered around the city, they would have been working on their own, but there might have been ways that they, could connect up with each other or check in on each other. And that's me speculating a little bit. It's such a good and important question. I wish I had a stronger answer for you.
I do have a follow-up question from the same person. She said, I'm not sure if you addressed this, but is there any documentation as to why they were on the street and not in a storefront?
That's a good question. So in some cases, some were in a store. And I think this has to do with, my work really looks at mobile peddlers, hucksters, and market women. So I haven't looked as carefully at people in fixed places of business. And I think that for poorest urban dwellers, if you had a few cents, you could, buy a few extra ears of corn, maybe, sell them on the street, buy some strawberries when they're in season, sell them. Like this was a way into enterprise that required very little capital. And so food was definitely being sold out of homes, storefronts, sort of fixed structures. And in my book project, I'm hoping to explore that piece of it more because I do think it's connected, as you suggest, to the topic that I have focused on. But it's more in my own sense, just like I had to put some boundaries around the dissertation, or I might never have finished it. But yeah, I think there are interesting ways where I suspect once I begin to look at this, somebody had a little bit of money, would sell a little bit of something on the street, maybe made a little more, found a more permanent spot.
Mhm. I also have another comment/question. Karen Brown says, great presentation, thank you. Apologies if I missed this, but are there recipes for pepper pot stews? And if so, what are the ingredients beside tripe and peppers? Thanks again.
Yes, there are, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, so I can list them off for you because I have a terrible memory for these things. Let me just pull this up. There's a cookbook from the 1790s that has a West India pepper pot, but this looks pretty similar to the pepper pot that that I would be talking about. So it is 2 pounds of lean veal, the same of mutton. Cut them small with a pound of lean ham. Then you're also going to have some beef, some tough bits of beef they call for brisket, with onions, carrots, celery, leeks, turnips, well washed, sweet herbs, allspice, cloves, mace. And those are the main ingredients. So you get a little bit of a sense of some of what would have been included.
Thank you for that. Doesn't look like we have any other questions through YouTube. I do have one here in the room. Just one moment.
Is there anything about pepper pot sellers, the whole topic, your dissertation that you would like to talk about, but it doesn't generally come up? You haven't had the chance?
I love that question. That's
Thank
every
you.
speaker. If I might go back to this is a man, actually, a male pepper pot seller, that John Coates, who himself sold in a tavern from a established space, or a sort of a permanent space. But something I didn't have time to get into in the talk that I was astonished by was, I had read through these newspaper articles in the Tickler, and they're, it's odd reading 19th century newspapers. Sometimes, you can't quite tell what they're getting after. You can tell that it's very mocking and very, disrespectful, and that the sort of actual meaning can be a little hard to piece together. And there was a number of them that included a man named Johnny Coates. It was spelled with a K, not a C. Coates was And so, and they were, I've got a pepper pot operation in the Hollow and I wish to sell it, blah, but it was very sort of insulting. And I thought it was just some weird made up thing, to be honest. And I included it in one of my chapters, an early version of my chapter. But I didn't realize until I was at the library company, reading through some of the materials there, that John Coates was a prominent, established, I don't know, restaurateur is kind of a modern term, but he ran an operation and was prominent enough that he was being attacked by this sort of racist set of newspaper articles, along with, like I said, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, these really important figures in Black Philadelphia. And it was like a thunderbolt when I was like, oh, John Coates was an actual person. It wasn't just some, racist frothing that this newspaper was doing. I mean, it was, but it was targeted at somebody very specific. And like I said, I cannot tell from the sources to what extent his wife and daughter were involved in the business. But it seems very likely that they would have been. And sort of to connect to a previous question, understanding, how his business came to be. I'm very, very curious about that. Did it start out small and get bigger? Or did he sort of arrive on the scene with some capital and this is what he decided to do with it? So this project is, I feel like the more I learn about it, the more questions I have about it. But I think about John Coates a lot, that he really provoked some ire among some quarters in Philadelphia through his work.
Thank you. It's good to hear what you're cooking up for your next next work. A follow-up question from the same person that asked about the recipe. They were wondering what kind of peppers were used, if you have any idea.
I've seen reference to cayenne pepper, but I think I want to be careful and not overgeneralize. And I know that black pepper also, which is like a different kind of pepper, not capsicum, was also included. But I want to be very careful and not sort of overstate what I know. Sometimes these recipes can be a little vague. Sorry, you know what I can do? I will put this slide back up. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to send this recipe that I found along. I think it's in a cookbook called The New American Cookery, or I'm not getting the title quite right. But I'm happy to send it along to anybody who's interested.
Thank you. That was the last question I have here, is how do we keep in touch and or stay updated on your work? So thank you for reading our minds there.
Yeah, my pleasure. And yeah, please, happy to keep the conversation going over email or any other forms.
All right, I have another question here in the room.
I was surprised to hear of pepper pot being sold so far north. Could you clarify how the dish made its way from the Caribbean to Philadelphia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the British Caribbean and Philadelphia were very tightly connected through commerce. I don't think in the modern age we think of those two places as being necessarily so related to one another, although they are, of course, through immigration and things like that now. But during the 18th century, they were very, very interconnected. So that was, I think, the key way that the dish made its way from the Caribbean to Philadelphia. There's some evidence, although I don't know that I fully agree with this interpretation, that the diaspora from Saint-Domingue after the Haitian Revolution brought pepper pot to Philadelphia. I don't think I don't agree with that because the chronology wouldn't make sense. I know that there's pepper pot in Philadelphia earlier in the 18th century, but I'd say that's the key way, through trade and the bringing of enslaved people from the Caribbean to Philadelphia. But yeah, you don't think of Philadelphia as the home of, a great home of like lovers of spicy cuisine necessarily, especially in this period.
Or Caribbean diaspora either.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Part of that British Atlantic world where they're sort of, all the commerce is mostly oriented toward the mother country, toward England or Britain, But there are commercial interconnections between North American colonies and the Caribbean. Yeah.
Well, I think that is it for questions from online and here in the room. But we really appreciate your presentation today. It was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for your good attention and wonderful questions.